I introduced myself the same way to every group of lost hikers, brazen teenagers, and startled campers I met beneath the black spruce. I was a ranger with Hollow Ridge National Park, and my job was to bring them back before the night did. I said it casually because around here there isn't much use for theatrics. People listen better when you're calm. But there was one thing I mentioned the first night of every season, usually while unrolling maps over the hood of my truck with moths tapping the headlamps. If you hear your name in the tree lane after dark, don't answer. Hollow Ridge lay 3 hours east of the last real town and an inch outside the edge of maps that got updated on time. It wasn't on the list of parks you put on postcards. We had more bog-than views, more weather than trails. The ridgelines ran like wet spine bone, a checkerboard of hemlock, birch, and old burns that never quite greened up right. I knew the fire roads by their potholes and the backcountry cabins by their smell, damp salt, stove soot, and mouse droppings. 15 years out here had given me an easy ritual. I checked the radios, logged the trail cams, drove up to Half Mile Summit for a look at the western basins, and returned in the blue hour to count who came out and who didn't. The rangers who lasted learned to accept the small wrongnesses. The way fog pulled downhill even when the wind blew up. The way sound traveled in startled bursts, like a thrown rock skipping a lake. We told the new seasonals it was the terrain. We told each other it was nothing. I told myself it was the park making itself known, the way a house does when you live in it long enough. You pick out the stair that creaks and the window that latches hard, and you declare it normal. Out here, normal just covered more ground. I ran the Southern District with one other full-timer, an older ranger named Beck who had the posture of a question mark and a laugh that lived in his nose. He taught me the trick to sleeping in a parked truck with your duty belt still on and how to cook canned stew in the dome of a lantern. He never talked about what sent him out here. Few of us did. The park collected strays, ex-military, busted-up city cops, biologists who got tired of meetings. You come for the quiet and then make peace with the kinds of noise that replace it. Insects like static, rain like applause on the aluminum roofing, wind like a saw. By my third year, I could recognize the trail at a teen party by the glitter of cheap beer cans half buried in fern, the drag marks of coolers pulling meaninglessly uphill, the mildew musk of a tent dried badly and packed worse. By my fifth, I could tell a moose's stride from a bear's from the soft heel toe of a human trying to be quiet. By my 10th, I didn't need to look at the map to know how far a shout would carry from the old cut line to the rock shelf at Grackle Creek. I knew which trail markers the porcupines preferred and which ravens had learned the weight and sound of a granola bar still in its wrapper. Every place has its story. Ours was about the cold pines, a stand of stunted white pines on the lee side of a shaggy hump the old maps called Miller's Knob. In summer, you could lean on them and feel the temperature slide away. The air there tasted like snow, even in August. The first superintendent claimed there was permafrost down deep. A geologist who came out once with a party of students shrugged and said it was probably an anomaly. What was to us was a landmark we didn't name on the trail maps and didn't send volunteers to clear. We did our own maintenance there. We kept our jokes short and our breaks shorter. I said the rule to the crews the same way I'd heard it the first time. I never smiled after. I never explained. If you asked, I'd shrug and say the woods played tricks with sound, that we had echo pockets and weird acoustics. I'd act like the rule was just a way of making you cautious in the dark. But it wasn't my joke to explain. It was the park's rule, and I had learned it the slow way. I had learned a lot of things the slow way. At the northern entrance, there's a board with the usual warnings. Check weather, pack water, tell someone when you go in. Twice a year, I'd have to add a temporary flyer about a missing dog or a seasonal bear advisory. The regular cautions became scenery. People step past them the way you step past your front gate when you're late for work. I stopped expecting warnings on boards to keep anyone safe. I relied on habits. Habits kept me alive like seatbelts you click without thinking. I checked tire pressure before I drove beyond the paved road. I tapped the radio antenna with the back of my hand to see if frost had iced the base. When I hiked solo, I counted my steps between blazes. When I stopped, I measured the quiet against other quiet I'd heard and tried to fit it to a known shape. Some nights, you can smell rain that hasn't fallen yet. It kisses the leaves and waits. Some nights the park goes a tone lower, like a big machine idling. The frogs dull, the owls stop, your boots make a different kind of sound that has nothing to do with the ground. Those are nights you drive the loop instead of walking it. Those are nights you radio in more than you need to. Those are nights you hear what sounds like someone calling a name that could be yours if you stripped it down to the bones and echoed it off bark and stone. The rule lived in my mouth like a prayer you didn't believe in until you needed it. I repeated it on autopilot. I wrote it in tiny block letters in the margins of my paper log when the radios went down and we had to take notes by hand. It wasn't official. It wasn't in the manual. It was simply the oldest thing I owned in this uniform, something I brought with me when I parked off the gravel and killed the engine and the night climbed into the cab like a passenger. On the day things began to feel different, truly, irreversibly different. I started the way I always did, with coffee that tasted like memories and boots that kept a history of last week's mud in their seams. The sun came up the color of the belly of a trout, and the fog lay so thick on the river you could use it as a path if you believed in that kind of thing. I didn't. I believed in schedules and check-ins and conservation easements and ordinance numbers. But I also kept a handful of dry matches and a film canister in my pocket, even though I had 3 separate lighters and a truck full of emergency gear. That's the kind of believer I was. I drove the south loop to the old quarry where the maples drop their leaves too early and coyotes have learned to wait near the parking lot for a snack that shouldn't exist. A minivan sat crooked in the turnout. All 4 windows cracked an inch and a string of plastic prayer beads swinging from the mirror. I ran the plates through dispatch, temporary line static, then the clipped voice of the new dispatcher, Torres, reading back a name that told me nothing except that someone had come to the ridge and hadn't left when the light told them to. I took a picture of the plate and left an orange note under the wiper reminding them of the time limits. The note wasn't for enforcement. It was an excuse to come back and check again tonight. Sometimes the only power we have is inventing reasons to go where our instincts tell us to look. On the way up to Miller's Knob, I passed the place where a storm 2 summers ago had twisted a stand of birch into a white basket. The road shoulders there always showed fresh gravel, even if no maintenance had been done. That bothered me because it implied attention I didn't authorize. Bother isn't danger, though. Bother is a pebble in the boot. The big pain comes later, and it always pretends to be something else first. I cut the engine at the Cold Pines pull-off, and the quiet came down like a heavy lid. Beck and I had joke-named it the cooler. The air there had the taste of penny metal on a tongue, the sour kiss of an old freezer. I walked the 30 yards to the first blaze and stopped, because I could see by the lay of the needles that someone had come through recently, but not by any path I recognized. The scuff marks didn't face each other the way feet usually do on a trail. They made long, parallel strokes, as if whoever made them never turned a shoulder to the shrubs. Moose, I thought, or a kid dragging something. Then I saw the heel marks at the end of the strokes, the neat rectangular bites in the soil, placed where toes should be. I stood there longer than I should have, cataloging, correcting, editing reality to make it fit a story I could write in a form. I told myself it was an illusion. Maybe a hiker had slipped and skidded backward. Maybe 2 sets of tracks had overlapped. Maybe I'd turned the wrong way down the trail and was looking at them upside down in my head. Then I looked up and saw that the blazes, those neat rectangles of white paint we put on tree trunks to mark the trail, were not where I had left them last week. They were higher, just an inch, maybe 2. In 15 years, I had never once looked at a blaze and thought, that paint looks taller. But I thought it then. I stared at a familiar patch of brush and felt my memory like a tight boot. The white rectangles stretched up the trunks like teeth that had grown in the night. I took photos. I measured with my forearm. I told myself trees grow, bark stretches, paint flakes. It can look different. It can. I followed the blazes 200 yards in. The wind threaded the pines with thin music, and the smell of something mineral rose out of the ground. The trail bent around a boulder that always reminded me of a kneeling horse, and there I found the ribbon. Neon orange, like the enforcement note I'd left on the minivan. But this ribbon wasn't ours. Wrong width. Wrong knot, tied at chest height instead of eye. It fluttered once. I stopped, and every made-up reason I'd ever used to explain away a feeling fell out of my head, leaving only the plain words I didn't want. Something had come through here and touched what I trusted. The first incident was small as a splinter. That's how the bad things begin, so you let them in. A blaze an inch higher. Tracks that put their heels first. A ribbon you didn't authorize tied where there shouldn't be anything but wind. If you asked me then, I would have said there was no incident at all. I would have said I was tired. I would have said the park was doing what it does, shifting between seasons, exhaling last winter and inhaling next. I cut the ribbon and pocketed it to show Beck later as a joke. I took more pictures because I've learned that later you'll want to prove to yourself that you saw what you saw. By noon, I had a stack of ordinary tasks to weigh down my thoughts. A blown culvert by the lower loop that needed flagging, a bare canister demonstration for a scout troop whose leader had the dangerous confidence of a man who had downloaded a lot of PDFs. I drove, I waved, I radioed check-ins, I ate a sandwich with one hand while ticking off maintenance codes on my clipboard. I thought about the minivan at the quarry and told myself I'd swing past again at dusk. I thought about the blazes and told myself I'd bring a tape measure tomorrow and prove they were the same. Around 2, a storm muscled up from the west. You can feel those storms before you see them. The clouds push the weight of their intention through the needles and into your skin. The radio snapped and squawked, and then Torres' voice went thin with interference. Lightning advisory, high wind, secure what you can. I turned toward the ranger station, already listing things I needed to tuck under eaves and latch down. Then the radio made a sound I had never heard it make, a soft, wet consonant like something living pressed against the mic. The static rose like boiling water, and then I heard my name. Not the way human mouths do it. Stripped, bone-lettered, half of it swallowed, half of it sharpened. It came from a tree line that ran close and parallel to the road, not from the radio at all. For a second, I let myself think it was the wind kneading sound into shape. For a second, I remembered the rule and felt dumb that I had told it so many times in a voice that implied I didn't truly need it. I rolled the window up and kept driving. I didn't answer. It was probably a trick of timing. The squall line arrived in a single shiver of light. The trees bowed in unison like a congregation. Pine cones hit the hood of my truck loud as stones. For an hour, I was too busy to think about anything but tarps, latches, and the way rain backs into buildings through doors that open the wrong way. I moved like a man in a puzzle, fitting small pieces of a day into a shape that made sense. When it passed, the air went soft and clean, and the gullies began their usual chorus, all throat and rush. Beck rolled up from a north station with a busted wiper and told me a tree had come down across the fire road near the old work shed. We drank coffee that had cooked too long and compared damage. I showed him the ribbon. He looked at it like he was reading a language he hadn't used in years. Kids, he said. Wrong knot, I said. Too clean. He rubbed his nose. A survey crew came through last fall. Could be leftovers. They use blue, I said, and they sent an email. We both glanced at the bulletin board where permits got tacked crooked and never read. It held a few sun-faded notices and a cartoon moose telling people to seal their food. No survey permits. No forestry flags. The storm had rearranged the papers cruelly so that the moose's speech bubble pointed to a missing dog flyer. We'll go look tomorrow, Beck said. Measure the blazes. Say your mind right. I almost said it called my name. I almost said the rule, which I had always kept for newcomers, felt like it had turned its head and looked me full in the face. But the room smelled like wet canvas and coffee and the corner where the old stove leaks rusty heat. And for a moment, it was easier to be the person who doesn't say things like that. So I nodded. I wrote an incident number on the corner of the ribbon like it was evidence. I put the ribbon in a clear bag and pinned it to the board like a butterfly. I made the evening loop late. The storm had knocked leaf shrapnel across the road, little green explosions everywhere. I turned off at the quarry to check the minivan. It was still there, windows now beaded with rain. There were 2 sets of prints leading up the trailhead, one small, one larger, both gone soft with weather. I wrote down the plate again as if the numbers could change. I told Torres I'd run a welfare check in the morning, just to be safe. She asked me if I wanted her to phone it into county. I said no, not yet. The light wasn't gone. People could get delayed for 100 ordinary reasons. A picnic that ran long. A fight that needed walking off. A promise made at the water's edge that took an extra hour to break. I carried my flashlight more for the way the beam made my thoughts behave than for the light itself. Light shapes the dark into a thing with edges. I swept it over the first 50 yards of trail. No litter. No obvious distress. A raven hopped into view, canted its head, and flapped away, sounding like a door hinge that needed oil. Back in the truck, I sat a while with the engine off. The trees clicked softly as rain shook loose. The road glowed with wet. From somewhere I couldn't place came a smell like turned earth, rich and grave-cool. Then the radio chimed with its cheerful programmed beep, and Torres said my call sign in her work voice, clipped and bright. I answered. Nothing else unusual, she said. A coyote sighting near Lake 2. A false alarm from the western gate. She told me to go home. The word didn't fit. Home, and here had become the same shape in my mouth a long time ago. On the drive back, I passed the pull-off for the coal pines and didn't stop. The pines stood like dark clergy against the sky. For a second, something between the trunks changed the shade of the dark, like a coat turned inside out. It wasn't movement exactly, more like the idea of movement. I pressed the gas a little harder than I needed to and told myself I was late for nothing in particular. Sleep came the way it does after a storm, like a hand palming the back of your head. I woke twice with a word in my mouth that tasted like iron. The second time I got up, drank water that had the faint copper flavor of old pipes, and looked at my boots by the door. Mud leaned in the treads at an angle that made it look like it should fall. It didn't. I lay back down and listened. The park has a night voice like a distant highway you never quite see. I told myself I was lucky to know it. I told myself the morning would wear all these thoughts down to their usual soft shapes. Before dawn I was up. Old habit. The light that early isn't a color so much as a feeling, a thinness that makes edges honest. I made coffee and packed a tape measure, fresh paint, spare nails, and a new box of fluorescent ribbon of the kind we actually used. I told Torres where I'd be. She told me to bring back a donut if I drove past Brackett's on the way. We always asked for small things like that. Small things keep you human. At the cold pines, the air went thin and tasted like snow, even though it was late summer. The needles underfoot looked like old brass. I measured the first blaze, 2 inches higher than the notes from last spring. I measured the second, 1 3/4 inches. The third, 2.5. Growth is never that neat. Bark does what it wants, but it doesn't do it overnight. I painted fresh and left neat marks with dates that could anchor me later if I needed anchoring. A jay rode the treeline, scolding nothing in particular, and the wind moved through the crowns like a hand fanning a deck of cards. At the rock that looked like a kneeling horse, I paused the way I always did because habits don't break on their own. The orange ribbon I'd cut yesterday had left a faint crease around the sapling. In its place, tied lower, was another. Same wrong width. Same wrong knot. A small, knot that kids don't learn and pro crews don't need. My mouth dried out. I looked at the bark for finger smears and found none. I looked at the ground for prints and found the same backward heel bites, crisper now, as if the storm had cleaned them. "You want me to see this?" I said aloud before I could help myself. Speaking in the woods like that always feels like borrowing someone else's voice. I untied the ribbon and didn't pocket it. I left it on the dirt like a shed skin. When I reached the low saddle on Miller's Knob, the air moved differently, like water in a place where a river splits. A smell came out of the ground that was part thaw, part animal bedding, part cellar. It made me think of my grandmother's basement, where the jars of peaches felt like sleeping things on the shelves, and the stairs at a bend you didn't watch your feet on unless you wanted to feel something breathing just behind you. The tape measure felt silly in my hand. The fresh paint in the truck felt like a denial. I cut off the trail to a spot I knew that wasn't on any map, a little bench with a view of the western basins, good for radio checks and head clearing. The moss there grows like velvet, bright in a way you only get after dark rain. I stepped onto it, and the ground gave more than usual, like a mattress, like something with memory. I stepped back and felt the shape of my foot return slowly like a pressed thumbprint rising in bread dough. The wind went soft. The jay stopped. The park in that moment didn't feel like a place I worked. It felt like a house I had let myself into without knocking, and the house had paused mid-breath, considering. I backed off the bench and returned to the marked trail because there are lines I don't cross alone, even after 15 years. The tape measure hung stupidly in my hand. I turned to go and heard bark pop like knuckles behind me and a single syllable like a name, but not mine. Or maybe mine said the way a water pipe says your name when the heat kicks on. I kept moving. I did not answer. I didn't look back because sometimes looking back is the reply you don't want to give. By late morning, I'd circled down toward the river flats to check a seasonal footbridge. The river ran high and tea-brown, sawing at its banks. A new log had lodged upstream. The bridge was fine. It was the river that looked like it wanted to own more of the world. As I crossed, a voice carried upriver, casual as a camp conversation. A woman's, light, the syllables stretched thin by distance. It wasn't calling me. It said okay, then okay again, as if answering someone's question the same way, twice to smooth a moment. I waited for the second voice. The river answered for it. The wind played translator and came up empty. On the far bank, a candy wrapper had caught in a tuft of grass. I folded it into my pocket and used the neatness of that act to slow my breathing. I told myself people talk in the woods. They pick up cell service in patches and take calls without thinking what their words do when they fall into moving air. I told myself the minivan belonged to a couple who said okay a lot, because you keep the peace that way by offering the same small assent until both of you believe it. I told myself stories until they fit. By the time I climbed back toward the quarry lot, the sky had gone the color of a bad bruise you only notice in a mirror hours later. The minivan sat in the same slant. A new thing was different. A damp picnic blanket laid over the back seat, as if drying. The windows were cracked the same inch. A single fly walked the glass on the driver's side, like it had a job. The license plate looked back at me like a face you think you recognize from a distance, and then can't place when you're close. I hesitated at the trailhead. The ground there was always chewed to mud by eager boots. Today it looked combed, not smooth. Combed, like fingers had drawn lines in the wet to lay it down. I crouched and hovered my hand an inch above the surface. The air 3 inches off the ground was cooler. I didn't move for a long time, and in that stillness I heard the woods thinking. That's how I described it later, when I had to say it out loud in a room with bad coffee and men who liked paper forms. The woods thought, and what they thought was me. I followed the trail 100 yards, then 2. I told Torres I was on foot. Welfare check, no assistance needed yet. She told me to keep my head, and I said I always did, but I didn't say it with a smile. The ribbon appeared again at knee height, tied to 2 saplings like a gate you could step through without touching. The knot had hardened. The ribbon had a crease like it had been folded on a table first, smoothed with a palm, then tied with care. Somewhere behind me, a name shaped itself out of wind. Not mine this time. It sounded like Ellie or Allie, or maybe even Kelly if you let the L swallow the K. I said nothing and let the quiet stand. The rule came up my throat like a swallowed thing, refusing to stay down. If you hear your name in the tree lean after dark, don't answer. It wasn't dark, and I picked at that technicality like a scab. The rule had never mentioned daylight. I had never asked it to. I found a candy wrapper half full of river grit tucked into a crook of roots, and a water bottle with a label that peeled away in a perfect strip. I found a scuffed circle where someone had turned in place, as if looking for a path that had shifted while they blinked. I found footprints with heels where toes should be. I found a place where the moss still remembered a weight and didn't want to let go of the memory. I found a little stack of stones on a stump that had never had stones on it before. I blew and the top one didn't move. When I turned back, the air behind me had rearranged. The trail looked the same, but my body didn't. I'd been here 1,000 times, and I had never felt heavier in my joints. The trees seemed closer. The light in the understory had a green cast I associated with deeper places. The jays scolded once from my left, and then again from behind, and then again from in front, like a mocking metronome. I came out to the lot and stood a while by the minivan because man-made edges can fix your thoughts when they start to fray. The fly had left the window. The prayer beads hung still. Inside, a folded tourist brochure lay on the passenger seat. It was one of ours, a nice photo of the river in a season when it pretended to be mild. Someone had circled the cold pines on the little map with a pen that had bled and faded as if it had been done weeks ago. It hadn't been. I knew which batch of maps that ink belonged to. I had printed them on Tuesday. I closed my eyes and pressed the heels of my hands to them until a shower of phosphenes made the world harmless and abstract. When I opened them, the woods were the woods again. Wind, leaves, the faraway sound of water pushing rock. I radioed Torres and told her I wanted a plate-to-owner check and a welfare notice pinned to the county board. She said okay twice, the way the voice upriver had done, and then asked me for the details I had already written down. I drove back to the station with the ribbon in the bag, whispering its plastic whisper against the board, and a new weight in my chest that was not fear exactly, but the recognition of a shape I had tried not to draw for years. The woods had always been alive. That wasn't the problem. The problem was they were now alive in a way that noticed me back. That night, I lay awake and listened to the wind take a long breath around the building. Far off, something knocked 3 times. Not woodpecker. Not branch against Eve. I could have gotten up and checked and found an ordinary cause, because ordinary causes exist like stones in a pocket. But I didn't move. I lay there with the rule folded small under my tongue like a pill you save for later, and I thought about the blazes that had grown and the ribbon that tied itself lower each time and the ground that remembered my weight a beat too long. The woods were different now. I had said the line to myself as a joke every time a trail washed out or a new superintendent came through with a shiny plan. Change is the only consistency. But I had not meant it like this. I had not meant like waking in the dead of lone night and knowing. The park was awake too, considering the way a house listens to the footsteps of someone who might be a stranger or might be family returning quiet, too quiet, at a bad hour. In the morning, there would be reports and phone calls and a drive up to the quarry with Beck to check on a minivan that should have been gone. In the morning, I would put my uniform back on and my voice back in the right shape. But the hours before dawn aren't ruled by forms. In those hours, the park told the truth to anyone willing to hold still long enough to hear it. It spoke in colder air and higher blazes and tracks that went heel first into the places where maps thin. And I lay still and listened and did not answer when it said my name from the tree outside the window that faced the cold pines. I did not answer at all. I kept the rule like it was the only thing I still believed in. Beck didn't answer his radio the first time I called him the next morning. That wasn't unusual. Coverage drops like a stone once you go behind certain ridges. But the second time, when all I got was an open hiss, my stomach tightened. I was parked at the quarry again, the minivan still there, but now wearing a skin of dust from the dry wind overnight. The blanket in the back seat was gone. So were the prayer beads. The sky had that washed-out look that makes you think of old film, overexposed, thin shadows. I started up the trail toward the cold pines, my boots making too much sound in the loose gravel. I kept my radio clip high on my shoulder so it could catch any stray signal. The tape measure was in my pack, but I didn't think I'd need it today. Today was about answers. 200 yards in, I saw the first blaze. New paint. Fresh, but not mine. The rectangle was just slightly off the shape we use, the corners too sharp, like a stencil had been pressed hard against the bark. The color was wrong too bright, like it hadn't been mixed from the stock we keep in the shed. And there was more of it than there should be. Instead of marking a single tree every 100 feet, the marks were on every third trunk I passed, zigzagging back and forth across the trail like they were steering me somewhere. By the time I reached the boulder that looked like a kneeling horse, my throat was dry. Not from exertion, from the air. It had that penny metal tang again, stronger than yesterday. The orange ribbon was back, tied at shoulder height this time, perfectly centered between 2 trunks. My hand hovered over it, but I didn't touch. Something about the knot made the hair at the back of my neck rise. It wasn't the same knot as before. This one was elaborate, like a braid frozen mid-motion. Whoever tied, it wanted it to hold. I radioed Beck again. Nothing. The hiss stayed steady, like breath on the other end. Past the ribbon, the trail bent toward Miller's Knob. The sound changed there. No birds. No wind. Even my own boots seemed quieter, as if the ground was taking the sound and keeping it. I slowed without meaning to. The trees ahead had that leaning posture I've seen after ice storms, like they'd been pushed once hard and never quite stood straight again. That's when I saw the first object. It was a shoe. Small. Children's size. Blue canvas. The kind you buy at a big box store for cheap. It was perfectly clean. Too clean. Like it had been placed there after the storm, after the mud. I crouched to look inside, half expecting it to be stuffed with leaves or gnawed by rodents. Instead, there was a scrap of paper folded into a neat square. I hesitated, then unfolded it. 3 words, written in blocky, careful letters. Don't answer back. My pulse thudded in my ears. The rule. Not exactly how I said it, but close enough. I looked around, slow, scanning between the trunks. Nothing moved. Nothing breathed except me. I put the paper in my breast pocket and left the shoe where it was. Further up, the blazes became erratic. Higher, lower, some smeared like someone had brushed against them while they were still wet. And then, in a clearing I didn't remember being there, I saw Beck's truck. It was parked at an angle, half on the trail, half in the brush. The driver's door was open. The cab was empty. On the hood sat his hat. The one he wore so long the brim had molded to his head. It was damp, though there'd been no rain. I called his name. Once. Twice. My voice sounded thin, swallowed by the trees. Then, from the far side of the clearing, a reply. Not his voice. Not human, not really. Just the shape of his name bent into something else, stretched and hollowed. It came from a tree lean, the same way it had for me yesterday. This time it said it again, softer, almost coaxing, and I understood, clear as the paper in my pocket, that it wanted me to step toward it. I didn't move. The voice tried again. Louder now. Closer. I stepped backward until my shoulder hit Beck's truck. My hand found the radio, thumb pressing the call button hard enough to hurt. Beck, I said. If you're hearing this, you answer now. The tree lean went still. The air pressed in. Then the voice said my name. Not like yesterday. Not from distance. It came from just behind the first line of trees, and this time it sounded like Beck. I turned and ran. Branches whipped my face. The trail seemed to shift under my boots, angles wrong, distances stretched. I kept my eyes on the blazes, even when they doubled back on themselves, even when they disappeared for 10 steps at a time. My lungs burned. My radio crackled with bursts of static that sounded almost like laughter. When I stumbled out into the quarry lot, the minivan was gone. So was every sound for a long, long time. I stood alone in the quarry lot and listened to the kind of silence that had weight. It pressed down on the shoulders and lived in the spaces between breaths. Wind moved the treetops, but the sound of it stayed up there. Down where I was, the air felt padded, like a room someone had lined with wool. I walked back to where Beck's truck should have been and found bare dirt. No tire ruts. No bent grass. As if the clearing had been iron flat. I knelt and touched the ground and felt cold seep up through the heel of my hand. It was the same cellar cold that bled out of the cold pines, but thinner, as if something were testing its reach. I called Torres and got a quick, clean reply this time. She sounded relieved to hear me, asked if I had eyes on Beck. I said no and gave her the coordinates of the clearing where his truck hadn't been a minute ago. She told me to sit tight. I told her I'd keep moving and that the lot was clear of the minivan. She paused, then asked me to repeat that. I did a little too fast. She said she'd make calls. The wind dropped a notch. A J scraped a note somewhere upslope and cut off mid-word like it had been shushed. Event 1 began there, whether I named it or not. I walked the ridge path toward the cold pines and let my boots set the pace. I kept my eyes on the paint blazes, trying to reconcile their wrongness with the thousands of times I trusted them. The bright rectangular stamps led me not along the trail we'd cut and maintained, but through small detours that meant nothing on a map and everything to your body. They led me over a runnel of stones that rolled like vertebrae and down the lee side of a hump where the air sat 3 degrees colder and tasted faintly of coins. At a bend where the path usually narrowed between 2 storm-bent firs, the trees had righted themselves. That's how it looked, anyway, like someone had reached in and set them straight. The gap between them felt like a doorway that hadn't been there yesterday. The needles that carpeted the ground inside that gap were laid in tidy lines, all pointing the same way. Something in me balked. My job had always been to go into the place where other people hesitated and to come back out in one piece with them in tow. Standing at that doorway made me feel like a tourist in my own work. I took a photo, even though I knew the picture would look plain as bread later. The camera never grabs the part that matters. 50 yards past that gap, I found the second object. A flip phone. Plastic, scratched, the kind of thing you keep for emergencies. It lay face up on a bed of moss lit. No service, battery half. The lock screen was a photo of a little boy in a blue shirt, squinting at the sun. The timestamp at the top of the screen said 3:12 a.m., which was wrong for a lot of reasons. Chief among them that it was late morning and the phone had no reception to update itself. I opened the call log and saw a single outgoing call from an hour earlier, dialed to a number with a local area code and an extra digit in the middle like a splinter. I set the phone down and the moss didn't spring back right away. The ground held the shape and released it like a breath you'd been told to take quietly. I kept moving because staying put felt like agreeing. The cold pines started as a change in flavor. The air went brassy. The light thinned. My breath made a small wick of vapor that disappeared quick. I stepped into the stand and felt that old freezer door swing shut behind me in my mind. The blazes here were the worst. Some of my chin, some of my knees, some doubling one another like a stutter. I told myself to focus on the practical. I told myself to compare bark layers and paint age and to think about what expansion and the way sap lifts. It helped for about 4 steps. Then I saw the trail cam. We mount them high to keep them safe from curious hands and teeth. This one had been lowered to my eye level and angled not at the trail, but across it into a wedge of brush. Our cams are stamped with inventory numbers. This one had a number I didn't recognize. Same brand. Same housing. Not ours. I took off my glove and clicked the release. The card slot clicked with the wrong resistance, like a door in a house you're visiting for the first time. I pocketed the card and snapped the empty cam back in place, because leaving it open made me think of a mouth. As I turned to go, I heard a voice from the stand's far edge, a woman again, saying okay in that too-even way. I tasted copper. The second okay sounded closer, like a hand laid flat on the other side of the thin door. I didn't answer. I walked out of the cold pines with the deliberate stride you use when you're being watched and don't want to tell the watcher what you know. Back at the truck, I slotted the card into the field viewer we keep in the glove box. The screen is terrible in daylight, all dim angles and ghostly glare. I tilted it until the images steadied. The first frame was normal, a sliver of trail, a strip of brush, a lot of shadow. The second showed a man in a ball cap passing through, mid-stride, face turned down, a blur that meant nothing. The timestamps ran like they should, tens of minutes, then a cluster of seconds. A deer nosed in. A squirrel turned its head so fast it looked headless. Then, half a dozen frames where the trees in the background weren't where they had been. You learn the posture of trees, the little asymmetries. These had shifted by inches, then feet, as if the cam had been remounted between frames, except the foreground stayed exactly the same. At the end of the sequence, 4 frames of empty trail, brightness clipped and odd like the camera was compensating for a light source it couldn't find. The last frame was black with a scratch across it that looked a little like someone dragging a nail through wet paint. The timestamp on that one said 3:12 a.m. to match the phone, and that was how I knew somebody was riding with my instruments. I called Torres, told her I had a trail cam that wasn't ours, told her I was heading to the river flat to look for the couple from the minivan. She said county had reached the registered owner, a woman from 2 towns over visiting with her brother and his kid. They were supposed to be out yesterday by dusk. No answer on either cell. She said she could send a deputy. I said not yet. She sighed in the way that means she's letting me pretend I still control anything. Event 2 rolled up like weather. On the way down, the fog came in thin and fast, a gauze that drifted at knee height. My compass needle jittered, then settled on a north that didn't match the lay of the land. When fog sits like that, sound rides it. I heard water where there shouldn't be water and the faint clinking sound of metal on metal, like a cheap bell in a breeze. The footbridge at the flats was intact. The river had dropped overnight and gone darker, the tea brown steeping into tar. I found prints in the mud on the near bank. Adult, child, adult. The adult prints looked wrong from the start. Too square at the heel, light at the toe. The kid's prints were scuffed, like the shoes were a hair too big. I followed them along the bank until they left the mud and stepped in a gravel that had been raked into tidy comb lines. At the edge of the gravel, a stick had been laid across the path like a pencil underlining a sentence. I crouched to pick it up and saw that the bark had been scraped away to expose the pale wood beneath. Someone had carved 3 short vertical notches into it and 1 long diagonal that crossed them. The kind of thing you do when you're keeping track of days and lose track. I turned the stick and noticed the gouges in the bright wood were smooth and burnished, like something with a soft mouth had worried them. The fog thickened to shin-high, then knee-high. The air above it stayed clear. It felt like walking on a cloud you could drown in. Over the current's low rumble, a child laughed once. Not joyful, more like a cough that didn't know it was a laugh. I froze and listened. The laugh didn't repeat. A deeper voice said, "Okay," and I realized I had begun to count how many times I'd heard that word, and it made me tired to keep count. My radio chirped and then went flat. Dead air. I checked the battery and saw a full bar. I said Torres' name anyway and got nothing. The fog breathed like an animal, pulling in and letting out. And in its exhale, I caught the smell of turned earth and something faintly floral, like a funeral home where they're doing their best. I backtracked to the bridge and took the long way up, avoiding the cold pines on the return. I kept a sunlit brush where I could feel heat on my forearms. Halfway up, I found a cairn I didn't build and hadn't seen yesterday. It was 6 stones tall, neat, slender, with a 7th laid flat next to it like a lid that hadn't yet been put on. Something, had set a ranger station coffee stir stick under the bottom stone. The white plastic looked silly in the dark dirt, like a straw wrapper on a church floor. Event 3 carried into evening and cut off the part of the day where you can lie to yourself. Back at the station, I ran the cam card through the old desktop that hates sitting idle. The frames played smoother there, and I could step through them with a key. In the second-to-last shot, the one before the black frame, the trees bent toward the trail, all of them a synchronized lean like wind you couldn't hear. In the very corner, behind a screen of fern that never grew there, a shape stood in the precise way that makes you squint. Not person-shaped, not animal-shaped. It had the posture of a stump you hadn't noticed, but the line of it was wrong, like seeing a face in an outlet plug, and only later realizing the mouth was underneath. I saved the sequence to a thumb drive and wrote the timestamps in my paper log, because writing by hand turns thoughts into facts. As I wrote, the overhead lights flickered once and steadied. The wall clock ticked 2 seconds fast, then jumped back without mercy. On the bulletin board, the plastic bag with the orange ribbon fogged on the inside like it had been breathed on. I called Bexell and got a voicemail greeting I'd heard 100 times. He sounded younger in it than he had any right to. I didn't leave a message. I walked out to the porch and watched the last wash of light roll off the tops of the spruce, leaving them inked against a sky the color of old steel. Torres pulled up in her sedan with 2 powdered donuts in a paper bag and a face that said she had done everything she could and it wasn't much. She'd talked to county. A deputy had checked the paved approach and found nothing. He could run up tomorrow with a partner if we filed an official request. I said we would if the family didn't check in by morning. She nodded and ate half a donut with the slow care of someone who'd been holding her breath all day. We watched darkness take the park the way water takes the low places first. The radio hissed and then cleared and then hissed again. Torres asked me what I had in my pocket, and I realized my hand had been resting on the scrap of paper from the kid's shoe as if it could leak out if I didn't hold it tight. I showed it to her. She read it twice and said nothing. When the night had fully landed, we did what we always did when there were too many loose ends to tie in one shift. We took a drive. She rode shotgun with a small notepad on her knee, and I ran the loop like a rosary, counting landmarks the way a person counts prayers. The road felt narrower than it should for a state-maintained strip of gravel. The trees threw our light back at us like they'd been oiled. Near the turnoff to the ridge path, we both heard it at once. A voice sang okay from the ditch. Torres put her hand on the dash without thinking, like a passenger in a bad car. I slowed. The beams brushed the ditch grass, and something moved just beyond their reach, not away from us, but along with us, keeping pace in the dark. The voice said okay again, closer like it had lips now. Torres swallowed and whispered, "If you hear your name in the tree line after dark, don't answer." The rule sat between us like a third person. It was the second time it had been spoken in full since all this started, and hearing it in someone else's mouth made me know I hadn't imagined its weight. I nodded once, as if to a supervisor I trusted. I pushed the accelerator down a quarter inch. We didn't talk for the next mile. The ditch stayed, even with the truck, as if the dark there had weight, and our vehicle had a magnet for it. Near the gate at the western lot, the voice changed. It said my name, not the hollow, chewed version. My name the way my grandmother had said it when she needed me to listen, and the way Beck said it when he found a tick on the back of his knee and was half laughing, half disgusted. It put the voice together from pieces of my life I hadn't given it. Event 4 broke the part of me that believed I could control the pace. We parked at the western lot and killed the engine to force the dark to show its cards. The silence that followed was so whole it rang. I stepped out and let my boots find the ground gently, like I was stepping onto someone's sleeping porch. Torres stayed by the truck, and I walked to the edge of the lot where the first line of trees hunched like listeners. "Beck," I said just once, letting the name be the size it needed to be. What answer was not Beck? It was not a voice, not really. It was the sound of bark stretching at night, and ice releasing a branch, and a fox stepping on dry leaves, and 100 other noises that live here. Altogether, they made something that traveled across the lot and touched my face with cold. Behind that, quiet as heat lightning, came my name again, threaded through with the last 2 syllables like a whisper waiting a wish. I nodded once to no one. I turned my back and walked to the cab. I did not answer. I didn't even look into the trees the way you do when you want to prove you're not afraid. Proving things is a way of giving them what they want. We spent the late hours of the station, making lists that meant nothing and checking batteries that didn't need checking. At 2 a.m., the power flickered again. The wall clock stopped holding time and let it swing. The radio went dead, then alive, then dead. And in the middle of that, a voice that sounded like Torres but flatter said my call sign twice. Torres looked at me from 6 feet away and didn't touch the mic. The voice said, "Okay," like a finishing nail. The radio went clear and empty. We slept in shifts. Sleep there meant closing your eyes and keeping your boots on. I dreamed once of standing in the cold pines with my mouth open and nothing coming out, and the trees leaning to hear better. When the gray smudge of morning arrived, my jaw ached like I'd clenched through the night. Event 5 waited where the day should have put its first good foot forward. The quarry lot held the minivan again, parked fresh, the paint mottled with dew. A new object lay on the hood. A stuffed rabbit. One ear bent the wrong way. Its fur had the stiff feel of a toy that's been dried too many times on too high a heat. Tucked under its paw was a Ranger incident form. The top sheet ripped from our triplicate pad. It had my handwriting on it. The date was today. The time was 3:12 a.m. The description line read, "Found by cold pines. Do not." And then a line through the rest, hard enough to tear. My body did what bodies do in the moment when the map of the world redraws without your consent. It went small and careful. I looked around with the slow turn of a man who has taught himself not to startle deer. The air above the lot was the right temperature. The shadows fell where sunrise said they should. The only wrong thing was that every tree on the lot's boundary had a fresh scar at about shoulder height, a pale slash where bark had been peeled away. Each slash was the same length, the same tilt, a row of eyes refusing to blink. I walked to the trailhead and found a string of stones running across it like a bracelet. Each stone had been marked with a dab of the wrong white paint. Between 2 of them, a shoe print weighted backward. I took the incident form from under the rabbit's paw and folded it along the lines my hand had taught it to remember over the years. I put it in my pocket. I picked up the rabbit and set it gently on the passenger seat of the minivan because leaving it on the hood felt like inviting something to watch. "Okay," Torres said behind me, quiet and not like the voice in the trees at all. "We escalate to county now." I nodded. We did the procedural things you do to make other people come into your problem. Calls, coordinates, references to policies that sound like spells when you say them over and over. I kept my eyes on the tree line and felt the kind of attention you can't name because giving it a name lets it set down roots. By noon, Clouds stacked in the west like furniture covered with sheets. I walked the lower loop alone while Torres waited for the deputy, who was always 20 minutes away until he wasn't. I found fresh blazes in places I had never put ablaze. I found a trail junction sign that we had set at a true north orientation tilted 12 degrees off, as if the park had decided to correct our correction. I found a bird's nest built in the crook of a trail map display, the chicks breathing in a fast secret rhythm. I stood there too long, listening to the tiny rush of their bodies turning air into life, and for a heart-stopping second, I heard my name in that rush. Not said, just present. When the deputy arrived, he was a young man with a smile that looked borrowed and a partner twice his age who had the eyes of a person who has seen things that didn't make it into reports. We took them to the minivan. We showed them the objects. We said the word cold pines like we were asking for a favor. They nodded and wrote, and asked us to repeat what time we had last seen the vehicle. We told them dusk, yesterday. The older deputy winced like the time had been a bad taste. Any wildlife incidents lately? He asked, as if a bear could tie a ribbon. Nothing that would do this, I said. Nothing that will make sense to you, if I say it in the time we have. He looked at me the way people look when they want you to be either crazy or right, and they can't decide which would be worse. We led them up the trail. The fog did its shin-high trick again, and the air above it turned bright and false, like a movie sky behind a stage. The younger deputy laughed once, the way people do when they don't know where to put their hands. The older one touched the gun he wouldn't need, as if to bless it. At the coal pines, the temperature slid, and all four of us felt it. We stopped together because that's what animals do when the air says wait. The older deputy shivered and said a different version of okay, without meaning to. The younger one said, "Smells like a cooler in here." "Yeah," I said. "That's what we call it." We showed them the wrong blazes and the tidy combed dirt in the doorway between the two straightened firs. The younger deputy stepped toward it, and I put a hand on his arm without thinking. He looked at me, surprised, as if he had been sleepwalking and didn't like being woken. Somewhere deeper, a voice said a name that wasn't mine and wasn't his, but could be either if you were careless with vowels. The older deputy said, soft as a secret, "Don't answer it." We kept moving, and the park let us. At the saddle, we found the family's footprints again. 3 sets. The child's prints pulled away from the adults, a gap that widened and narrowed like a heart rate. On a stump the size of a kitchen stool, someone had set 3 apples in a row. They were fresh, unwormed, beads of water on their skin. The middle one had a neat bite taken from it, the kind a kid makes when they're told to just try a taste. The exposed flesh hadn't browned. The bite mark had no teeth. We stood around those apples like men around a small fire they weren't sure they'd lit. The younger deputy reached out, then thought better of it, then reached anyway, then thought better of it again. The older one cleared his throat and said he'd be very happy if we all took a large step backward and pretended we hadn't seen them. So we did. We followed the prints to a place where the moss remembered the knee of a small body. Further on, we found a piece of a brochure folded into a crane, set on a flat rock. I picked it up, and it unfolded itself in my hand without tearing, even though paper doesn't do that. The circled cold pines had been rubbed until the paper thinned. Underneath the circle, with a child's slow care, someone had written, Ellie. The wind breathed out, and the stand breathed in, and somewhere a branch let go with a sound like a laugh that didn't want to be one. The older deputy said he'd seen enough to write, and I told him we'd barely started. He looked at me kindly and said that might be the problem. We brought them back to the lot without losing them, and that felt like a win the way getting home without a ticket feels like a win. They promised to canvass the paved road pull-offs and to log a report that would do its best not to sound insane. I believed them, which in that moment made me feel lonelier than if they had laughed. When they were gone, the day went thin and colorless, the way days do when you realize they've been holding their breath for you. I walked to the station and found the power off and the clock on the wall, pointing both hands straight down like it was ashamed. The radio glowed without sound. I set the trail cam card on the desk, and next to it the phone with the boy in the blue shirt, and next to that the incident form with my handwriting I didn't write. I said the rule aloud, once in the empty room, because I wanted the walls to hold it for me. If you hear your name in the tree lean after dark, don't answer. Hearing it a second time and my own voice did what I needed. It put a seam back in me. It was only the second time out loud. I tucked the third away for when I knew I'd need it. Night came with the steadiness of someone who knows you'll open the door. I sat by the window that faced the cold pines and watched the dark make a fist. Somewhere between the first and second hour, a shape stood between the nearest trunks with the patience of a knife in a drawer. I let my eyes pass over it and not return. The radio said my name in the flattened knot voice, and then in Beck's voice, and then in my grandmother's. I touched the mic with one finger and left it there like a man promising a prayer he hasn't said in years. Around the hour when the body forgets itself and remembers it all at once, I heard the small sound of someone knocking very politely on wood. 3 times. Then the polite knock again, closer, on the wall opposite the window, the wall that faced nothing but the slope and stand. The rule sat in my mouth like a coin. The knock came a 3rd time, right next to my head, from inside the wall where no hand could fit. I stood without standing, one of those body tricks fear plays, and I walked to the door and opened it and let the cold come in and be itself around me. The dark held its breath in return, and together we waited for the part where one of us would have to break first. And that's where the park stopped being a place I worked and started being the only thing in the world that could hear me think. At first light, Torres was already in the main room, a thermos of burnt coffee on the table, and her jacket zipped halfway like she'd been about to leave. She said nothing at first, just nodded toward the window that faced the lot. The minivan was gone again. No tire marks, no engine noise in the night. Just gone, the way a campsite can vanish in the hour it takes for fog to settle and lift. On the table next to her was the stuffed rabbit from yesterday. "I didn't bring it in," I said. "Neither did I," she replied. We stared at it. It was still damp, though last night had been dry. The dampness smelled faintly of pine pitch and something mineral like the inside a cave. Torres reached for it, stopped short, and instead pulled an evidence bag from the cabinet. She slid the rabbit inside without letting it brush her skin. "We should catalog," she began, then stopped mid-word. From the radio on the counter, the call sign crackled. Clear, like a normal transmission. "This is Beck," the voice said. "Calm. Steady." Torres looked at me sharply. "Copy," I said into the mic. "Your location?" A pause. Then at the pines. "Bring the ribbon." That last part froze the air in my lungs. I hadn't told anyone about the wrong orange ribbon except Torres and Beck before it kept returning on its own. Torres leaned close. "That's not," she started. The voice came again, sharper. "You're wasting time." The radio went to static, then silence. We packed up anyway, because not going wasn't an option. Not for me. When we reached the cold pines, the air was colder than it had ever been in my memory. Breath didn't drift. It hung, curling in on itself like it didn't want to leave the body. Halfway in, we saw the blazes. New again, brighter still, each one marked on both sides of the tree, as though meant for someone traveling both ways at once. "That's not how we paint," Torres murmured. 100 yards further, the ground flattened into a space I didn't know, and I know every contour of that stand. In the center stood a circle of those straightened firs. Inside the circle, 3 objects rested on the needle-carpeted ground. Beck's hat, the phone with the boy in the blue shirt, and the ribbon, tied into a perfect loop. Torres reached for the radio. "Beck, if you're hearing this." Her voice cut off. Not the radio. Her voice. She was still speaking, lips moving, throat working, but no sound came out. I stepped toward her, and my boot sank deeper than it should have, the ground giving as if it were holding water just under the surface. My ears popped like I'd changed altitude. Then my voice came from the trees behind me. "Leave it." I turned. Nothing but the wall of pines. But I knew, the same way you know someone's watching you through a window you haven't looked at yet, that something was closer than it had been the night before. Torres grabbed my arm, her voice back. "We're leaving. Now." We made it 20 yards before the woods shifted. Not moved, shifted, like they'd been rearranged in the space of a blink. The blazes now all faced the opposite direction, pointing us deeper. We didn't follow them. Back at the station, we locked every door and shut every blind. Torres called county, told them to send 2 cars, no delay. They said they would. Then the line cut. Not the call, the power. The hum of the refrigerator died. The clock froze mid-tick. The only sound left was the faint tap-tap-tap from the south wall, spaced like a heartbeat. I knew that wall faced the slope above the river flat. No one should be able to reach it without crossing 50 yards of open ground. The tapping stopped. Then the voice said Torres's name. She went pale, backed up until her shoulders hit the bulletin board. Say the rule, I told her. She did. Clear. Firm. Once. The voice didn't stop. It said her name again, softer, like it was coaxing her closer to the wall. I took the mic, keyed it, and said, You don't get to use our names. The reply came from inside the building. Not the radio. Not the wall. Inside. Then give me yours. That night we didn't sleep. The deputies never arrived. By morning, the cold pines looked closer from the station windows than they ever had before. By the third morning, the cold pines felt like they were leaning toward us. Not physically. The treetops on the ridge were exactly where they should have been, but inwardly, like their focus had narrowed until the ranger station was the only thing worth noticing. The deputies still hadn't come. Torres kept calling county, but every time the line connected, her voice got swallowed mid-sentence, replaced by either static or the faint sound of someone breathing. We were down to routines. Check perimeters, log weather, pretend everything was normal. But when the eastern sky went leaden before noon, I knew the park was moving faster than we were. We took the truck to the quarry lot. The minivan was back again. This time, its back hatch stood open. Inside were 3 backpacks, 2 adult, 1 child. Each had been emptied, the contents spread in neat semicircles on the gravel. Shoes, water bottles, granola bars, a single paperback with its cover torn away. The pages fluttered in the dead air like they were underwater. At the very center of it all sat a trail cam. The same wrong kind as before. I lifted it, checked the screen. It was already playing. No buttons pressed. Just frame after frame of the cold pines. The first showed the trail, empty. The second, 3 figures walking in, 2 tall, 1 small, all facing away. The third, the same 3, but the child's head was turned back toward the lens, mouth open as if speaking. The fourth me, standing where the child had been, looking directly into the lens, expression flat. Torres swore under her breath. You weren't. I know, I said. The last frame was black, but the audio feed hissed on. Underneath the hiss, a voice, not loud, not whispering, said my name 3 times. Each one was a little closer than the last. We left the gear where it was and followed the trail in. The air dropped, not cooled, dropped like walking into a sinkhole in mid-step. The needles underfoot didn't crunch, they muffled. Every sound we made seemed to sink straight into the ground. The blazes were now at exact head height for both of us. I don't mean approximately. I mean exact. Mine painted where my eyes hit level, Torres's where hers did. At the stand's heart, we found Beck. Or what looked like Beck. He stood just inside the ring of straightened furs, hat in his hand, head tilted slightly like he'd been listening. His skin was the wrong shade. Not pale, not dark, just off like someone had forgotten the undertones. You brought the ribbon, he said. His voice was Beck's. His mouth was Beck's. But the cadence was all wrong. Clipped where it should have drawn out, slow where it should have snapped. I didn't, I said. He smiled without moving the rest of his face. You will. Torres shifted, hand near her sidearm. Beck, we need to. Not Beck, the voice cut in, still smiling. Not anything you get to keep. The pines leaned, not all at once, more like a ripple moving around the circle. Shadows thickened between them until they weren't just shade anymore, but passages. From each passage, a sound, footsteps, breathing, names spoken in borrowed voices. The air smelled like turned soil and something faintly sweet like overripe fruit. I took a step back, but the ground rose behind me like the edge of a bowl. No way out except through. The Beck shape raised his hand. In it, the orange ribbon. It wasn't wrong anymore. It was ours. Perfect width, perfect knot, even the faint stain from when I dropped paint on it last year. You tie it where I show you, he said, where you follow her voice instead. From my left, deep in one of the dark passages, came a child's voice. Ellie. It was small, urgent, real. Torres's eyes met mine. She shook her head hard. The Beck thing stepped closer. No sound in his footfalls. Say my name, it told me. I don't know it, I said. The smile widened. You do. The shadows pushed closer, the passages narrowing until I could see movement in them. Pale shapes that slid between trunks without touching. They whispered in unison, a low chorus of okay, 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 until the word meant nothing at all. I reached for the ribbon, not to take it, but to break the moment. The Beck thing's hand shot forward, faster than human. Fingers closed around my wrist, cold and dry as bark in January. The instant it touched me, every tree in the ring leaned in, and from all around, in voices I knew and didn't know, came my name, over and over, overlapping, each one a little sharper than the last. I did the only thing left. I said the rule, out loud. The third time. Everything stopped. The voices cut. The shadows froze. Even the Beck thing's grip slackened, just enough for me to wrench free. Torres grabbed my arm. We ran. The blazes spun behind us, reorienting toward the heart of the pines, trying to turn us back. But the ground sloped now, downhill, carrying us faster than our legs could keep up. Branches scraped, but didn't break. Needles hissed past. The air warmed by degrees until it felt like we'd stepped through a membrane. We burst out into the quarry lot. Empty. No minivan. No packs. No ribbon. Just silence. We didn't stop running until the ranger station came into view. My legs ached from the descent, lungs ragged from pulling in air that still tasted faintly of pine pitch and turned soil. Torres slammed the door behind us and threw the bolt, then dropped into a chair like gravity had finally noticed her again. For a long time, neither of us spoke. We just sat there, listening, not to what was out there, but to whether it was still out there. It was. The air inside the station had that odd thickness again, the kind that made each breath feel borrowed. On the desk lay the trail cam I'd left here, the one I'd pulled from the cold pines. I hadn't brought it in from the truck. Neither had Torres. It was already on. Frame 1, the ring of straightened furs, empty. Frame 2, the same ring, but from above, as though the camera were 40 feet in the air. Frame 3, Torres and I in the quarry lot, moments ago, running toward the station. Frame 4, the inside of the ranger station, the angle from the corner where the wall meets the ceiling, where no camera existed. In the corner of that frame, my own back as I shut the door, Torres reached for the power switch, but before she could, the last frame appeared. The two of us, seated exactly as we were now, looking at the camera. Only in the picture, there was a third figure standing between us, wearing Beck's hat. The power went out then, not a flicker, but a clean, total absence. We sat in the dark with only the faintest light leaking through the blinds. Outside, the cold pines were closer again. I could feel it without looking, the subtle change in air pressure, the faint shift in scent, the sense of a shadow leaning over your shoulder. County finally called in on the backup sat phone an hour later. Said they'd had a delay, but units were inbound. I told them not to bother coming after dark. Didn't say why. Torres and I made an agreement without speaking, no more stepping into the pines. Not after what we'd seen. Not after what it had tried to make us do. But I knew, in the way you know you're going to see a storm again before it's over, that this wasn't about the pines anymore. It was about attention.